You've been told Roman helmets evolved through incremental improvements in metalworking technique. But when archaeologists mapped the distribution of head trauma in Gallic warrior burials versus Roman soldier remains, they found something that forced a complete rewrite of military equipment history. Gallic smiths weren't just making helmets for Rome. They were solving a specific anatomical crisis that Roman metallurgy had failed to address for 3 centuries. Right now, in museum collections from Alesia to Mainz, there are hundreds of imperial Gallic helmets stamped with makers' marks from workshops in Lyon, Autun, and Besançon. And every single one shares a design feature that doesn't appear in Italian-made helmets from the same period. Reinforced cranial ridging, engineered specifically to deflect downward blade strikes that Gallic longswords had been optimized to deliver for generations. The Romans didn't adopt Gallic helmet production because it was cheaper or more convenient. They adopted it because their soldiers were dying from a specific type of catastrophic head wound that only Gallic smiths understood how to prevent. And the evidence has been hiding in plain sight in skeletal collections and metallurgical analyses for decades, while popular history kept repeating comfortable myths about Roman technological superiority. Here's what we know for certain. During the Gallic Wars between 58 and 50 BCE, Julius Caesar's legions fought Celtic tribes whose primary infantry weapon was the spatha, a longsword averaging 75 to 85 centimeters in length, designed for devastating overhead cuts. Roman gladius swords were shorter, optimized for close quarters thrusting in tight formation. The tactical doctrine assumed Romans would close distance rapidly, get inside the reach of longer Celtic weapons, and use shield wall discipline to negate the Gauls' reach advantage. But read Caesar's own accounts carefully. Commentarii de Bello Gallico contains repeated references to massive Roman casualties during initial engagements, specifically mentioning head wounds that penetrated helmets. Book 7 describes the siege of Alesia, where Roman soldiers suffered greatly from missiles and from the swords of the Gauls, which struck down from elevated positions. That phrase, struck down from elevated positions, is crucial. It's describing a specific attack angle that Roman helmet design hadn't accounted for. Now examine the skeletal evidence. Excavations of Roman military cemeteries from the mid-1st century BCE show a disturbing pattern. Approximately 37% of identifiable combat casualties display evidence of sharp force trauma to the cranium, deep linear cuts that penetrated the skull, often extending from the crown down through the temporal bone. These aren't glancing blows. These are strikes that went through the helmet, through the skull, and into the brain. Comparative analysis of Gallic warrior burials from the same period shows a much lower rate of successful cranial penetration, only about 12%. The Gauls were protecting their own heads more effectively than the Romans were, despite fighting with the same weapons that were killing Roman soldiers. Here's where it gets disturbing. Roman helmet production during the Republican period was centered in Campania and Etruria, using techniques inherited from Greek and Italian metalworking traditions. These helmets, the Montefortino and Coolus types, were beautifully made, bronze work of exceptional quality, but they had a fundamental design flaw: a rounded dome profile with minimal structural reinforcement. When a Gallic longsword struck that dome at a downward angle with the full force of a warrior's two-handed swing, the metal deformed inward. It didn't need to completely penetrate. It just needed to transfer enough kinetic energy to fracture the skull underneath. And the archaeological evidence shows that's exactly what happened, repeatedly, across multiple campaigns. Listen carefully to what the metallurgical analysis reveals. When researchers examined surviving Montefortino helmets with battle damage, they found something unexpected. The bronze alloy used in Italian production was optimized for casting and surface finish, not impact resistance. It had relatively low tin content, around 8 to 10%, which made it easier to work but more brittle under shock loading. Meanwhile, Gallic bronze work from the same period shows tin content of 12 to 15%, producing an alloy that's harder to cast but significantly more resistant to deformation. The Gauls had been dealing with their own longsword strikes for centuries. They'd figured out the metallurgy through trial and error, through watching what happened when blades met helmets on the battlefield. But the real breakthrough came after the Gallic Wars, when Rome began establishing military production in newly conquered Gaul. Around 10 BCE, during Augustus's reorganization of the legions, helmet production shifted dramatically. New workshops opened in Lugdunum, modern Lyon, and started producing what archaeologists call the imperial Gallic type. And here's what makes this significant: these weren't Roman designs manufactured in Gaul. These were Gallic designs, incorporating Gallic metallurgical knowledge and Gallic understanding of how longswords interact with helmets, being produced for Roman legions. The imperial Gallic helmet is instantly recognizable. It has a pronounced ridge running front to back along the crown, a structural reinforcement that channels impact force to the sides rather than allowing direct transmission to the skull. It has extended cheek guards that protect the jaw and neck. It has a reinforced brow ridge that deflects downward strikes away from the face. And crucially, it's made from iron rather than bronze, using techniques that Gallic smiths had developed for producing their own war gear. The design isn't Roman. It's purely Celtic, adapted for legionary use. Now understand the machinery that made this transition necessary. The Roman military establishment didn't want to admit that their equipment was inferior. Military conservatism is institutional. Generals and armor suppliers in Italy had financial and political interests in maintaining existing production networks. Changing helmet designs meant acknowledging that Roman soldiers had been dying preventable deaths because the equipment wasn't adequate. It meant admitting that conquered barbarians had superior metallurgical knowledge, but the casualties kept mounting, and eventually practical necessity overwhelmed institutional pride. We have the production records. Workshop stamps on imperial Gallic helmets show manufacturing centers in Gaul, not Italy. We have the distribution evidence. By 20 CE, virtually every legionary stationed on the Rhine and Danube frontiers was wearing Gallic-made helmets. We have the casualty data. Cranial trauma rates in military cemeteries dropped significantly after the adoption of imperial Gallic types. The evidence is comprehensive and undeniable. Rome's most iconic piece of military equipment, the helmet that defined the imperial legions for 3 centuries, was a Gallic invention that Rome adopted because its own technology was getting soldiers killed. This is the part military historians rarely emphasize. The transition to imperial Gallic helmets wasn't just about improved protection. It was about acknowledging tactical reality. Gallic and Germanic warriors weren't going away. Their longswords weren't getting shorter. And Roman formation tactics meant legionaries would continue facing overhead strikes from taller opponents using longer weapons. The choice was either redesign the helmet using Gallic expertise or accept continued catastrophic head casualties. The Roman military chose survival over pride. But the historical narrative smoothed over that choice, treating it as natural technological evolution rather than what it actually was, a forced adaptation driven by battlefield failure. Read the imperial correspondence carefully. Letters between provincial governors and the Senate during Tiberius's reign contain references to equipment procurement following the Gallic method and according to the practices proven in the northern campaigns. These are bureaucratic euphemisms for our Italian helmets weren't working and we had to copy what the Gauls were doing. The language is deliberately vague because admitting Roman equipment inferiority wasn't politically acceptable. But the procurement records don't lie. By 30 CE, helmet production in Italy had collapsed. The workshops in Campania that had supplied the legions for 2 centuries were defunct. All production had shifted to Gaul. And here's what makes this transition so significant for understanding how military technology actually develops. The Gallic smiths didn't just copy Roman designs with minor improvements. They redesigned from first principles, applying their own understanding of combat mechanics and metallurgy. The cranial ridge that defines imperial Gallic helmets appears on Celtic helmets from the 2nd century BCE. The extended cheek guards mirror designs from Latine culture burials. The iron construction methods come directly from Gallic swordsmithing traditions. Rome didn't improve on its own designs. It wholesale adopted superior foreign technology because its soldiers were dying. The skeletal evidence makes this undeniable. Examine the remains from legionary fortresses along the Rhine frontier. Soldiers buried before 10 BCE show that 37% cranial trauma rate. Soldiers buried after 20 CE, when imperial Gallic helmets had become standard issue, show cranial trauma rates of less than 8%. That's a 78% reduction in fatal head wounds. Thousands of lives saved because Rome finally admitted that conquered Gauls understood helmet design better than Roman armorers did. But understand the cost of that institutional resistance. For 3 decades after the Gallic Wars, Roman soldiers continued wearing inadequate helmets even though superior designs were available. Even though the Gauls themselves had proven those designs worked. Conservative military procurement meant men died preventable deaths because changing equipment suppliers and acknowledging foreign superiority was administratively and politically difficult. The bureaucratic inertia killed as surely as any Gallic sword. Here's the evidence that historians still struggle to integrate into popular narratives. Museums display imperial Gallic helmets as examples of Roman military ingenuity. Documentaries praise Roman engineering without mentioning that the most effective piece of legionary equipment was designed by Celtic smiths. Military history textbooks describe the evolution of Roman helmets as a linear progression of Italian innovation. But the maker's marks tell a different story. The metallurgical analyses tell a different story. The skeletal trauma patterns tell a different story. And that story is uncomfortable because it contradicts the narrative of Roman technological dominance that's been taught for centuries. The Gallic workshops in Lyon and Autun produced helmets for Roman legions until the 4th century CE. 7 generations of smiths, working in the same facilities, using the same techniques, supplying the armies that conquered half of Europe. The designs evolved. Later imperial Italic helmets incorporated some of the Gallic innovations, but the fundamental truth remained. The helmet that protected Roman soldiers from head-cleaving strikes was a Gallic invention, born from Gallic understanding of combat mechanics, produced by Gallic smiths using Gallic metallurgical knowledge. This changes everything we think we know about Roman military equipment. The standard narrative treats Roman arms and armor as the pinnacle of ancient military technology, superior to anything barbarian tribes produced. But when you examine specific pieces of equipment, when you track production centers, when you analyze combat effectiveness through skeletal evidence, what you find is selective adoption of superior foreign technology whenever Roman designs failed. The gladius itself was adapted from Spanish swords. Cavalry equipment came largely from Celtic and Sarmatian sources. Artillery technology was borrowed from Greeks and Carthaginians. Roman military dominance wasn't about technological superiority. It was about organizational capacity and the willingness to adopt whatever worked, regardless of origin. The definitive truth is this. Roman helmets were made in Gaul because Roman-designed helmets weren't preventing head-cleaving strikes from Gallic longswords, and Gallic smiths had already solved that problem through centuries of experience with the same weapons. The transition to imperial Gallic production wasn't evolution, it was crisis response. And the delay in making that transition, the institutional resistance to adopting barbarian technology, cost thousands of Roman soldiers their lives. The helmets displayed in museums as symbols of Roman military prowess are actually symbols of Rome's capacity to recognize its own failures and adapt by incorporating superior foreign knowledge. That's a more impressive achievement than simple technological dominance, but it's also a more complex and uncomfortable truth than the narrative we've inherited. If you've learned anything from this investigation into ancient military technology and the uncomfortable truths buried in archaeological evidence, hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting, because we're going to keep uncovering the stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. The evidence is always there, waiting in museum storage and academic journals for anyone willing to ask the right questions. So what uncomfortable historical truth should we investigate next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below.